I grew up in the 60s, early 70s in Berkeley, California. I was part of all that. My father worked at the university, so I was inevitably sort of drawn to that. And that was the time of, originally the free speech movement in the early 60s, and then it turned into all the anti-Vietnam protests and so on, and then hippies and drugs and everything. I went off. I became a Christian as a teenager. I think that in itself already set me on a course that was going to be different from my upbringing, the context of my upbringing. Although it has to be said that the Berkeley University of those days was a great place, truly of free speech. And I wandered around and listened to street preachers. There were street preachers who would come up and down the west coast of California, maybe up to Seattle, I don't know, on a regular circuits, preaching outside. And I would listen to them. They caught my attention. Not the only thing that drew me to the Christian faith, but they were part of it. Um, but nonetheless, I was formed in that. I went off after college to seminary. I got ordained in the Episcopal Church, very liberal church. Although, again, at the time, 1970, 1981, when I was ordained, more diverse today. And went off to work as a missionary in Burundi in East Africa, which I did for several years. And I went there as a somewhat reflective liberal, but I was a liberal. It was my understanding, the values of a certain kind of democratic system and the way education takes place and so on and so forth. And Burundi, a well-known country right to the south of Rwanda, people know about that, very similar countries in some of their experiences for the worse. And I arrived in 1981, 9 years after a terrible civil war that saw the massacres along ethnic regional lines of hundreds of thousands of people. It was a calm period then that I was there, but run by military dictatorship from one of the sides of the Civil War. And things were not good. I mean, there was a lot of political repression and difficulty, and my students had all suffered through the war, lost parents and siblings and so on. And the whole educational system was in a wreck. The average age of the priests in Burundi when I arrived there was over 60. None of them had been to high school. And that was largely because most of the younger educated people had been slaughtered during the Civil War. So this was the first effort to try to get some younger people back into the educated ranks of the clergy. But it was under these terrible political pressures, bearing the burdens of a lot of suffering and trauma. And I think I went in there. I mean, I hope to some degree I was modest enough and humble enough to listen, but I was not modest and humble enough to learn as deeply as I might have what was really going on. And I had my ideas of how, by and large, things should be. I got all that active, but I wrote some things. I was eventually arrested and deported. And then the country descended into another decade, over a decade long civil war. So that experience, I was very involved then from the outside, writing letters and trying to get people involved and the refugees and so on. I realized in this small, because Burundi was it remains a very small country, small scope of political life, how absolutely difficult it is to create these grand, renovated societies where justice reigns and the ills are righted, and nothing doesn't hope for these things. But up close, I think that was helpful to me because, as I say, it's a very small country. You could know people from one side or the other, people in the government, people outside of the government, outside governments like the United States and outside aid organizations, the press, and this, that, and the other. You can't get these countries straight sitting down and figuring out all the right policies and so on. I'm not saying you can't make things and shouldn't try to make things better, but I learned the limits. That was where you started with. And coming back to the United States, living, working, because I've always been involved until relatively recently in various areas of great social ferment. I worked and lived in Brooklyn, New York. I worked in the inner city in Cleveland and elsewhere. Um, uh, Worked with Haiti and Haitian refugees. Um, I've realized in the United States and then obviously elsewhere, if Burundi is complicated, the United States is complicated by a further factor of 10, 20, 30 times. Let's go to other countries. These things don't work the way our little political minds mechanistically think they can be sorted out. So anyway, this is a personal thing. It doesn't go to the Christian aspect, but it forced me to think about the grand callings that so many of us take for granted as contemporary Christians, that we're supposed to, as Christians, our vocations are either in large part or even primarily to reorganize society along, I don't know, whatever Christian lines or lines of justice or what have you. This is wrong. I mean, it just doesn't, it not only doesn't work, it actually doesn't fit, in my mind, theologically, the Christian calling. And by and large, Christians until the early modern and later modern period never thought in those terms anyway.
As I'm listening to you speak, I'm remembering something I heard some years ago where a man said that when I was 20, I wanted to change the world. When I was 50, I thought if I could just be a little bit less of an idiot today than I was yesterday, then we're making progress. It sounds like he went through this process. Tell me if this is on the same track, but he went through this process of, thinking that he could make a huge, and this isn't pessimistic, we're just talking about how the world actually is, thinking he can make a huge difference in the world. And there are some people who make a huge difference in the world, although often for the bad. But he thought he could make a huge difference in the world for the good, and realize that that wasn't in the cards for him, not because he didn't try, but just because the world isn't a place that's malleable like that. And he just
Well,
realized,
and that's right.
yeah,
That's right. And I'm glad you mentioned this isn't a matter of pessimism or cynicism. You get old and nothing works anymore, and you roll your eyes at young people. That's not the issue. The issue is actually, and I've spent a lot of my theological work until more recently working on the question of ecclesial church division, um, theologically and practically. Big issue amongst Anglicans, but I've been involved in the ecumenical thing, and realizes how absolutely difficult it is for Christians to reconcile today, given the divisions that have been in play for so long. And why is that? So the issue here for me is not cynicism or pessimism, but study, to be quite honest, and mostly study of Christian organizations, groups, churches, collectives, and the individuals who lead them and take counsel and make decisions. So I've moved from thinking about, if you will, ecclesial politics to larger politics, because clearly to me they're reflective one of the other.
so you're a dual citizen now, United States and Canada. So to connect the discussion now to our thinking about government, or to your thinking about government, let me put you on the Quebec side of the Ottawa River, and you're with a student, and you're looking across the Ottawa River there at Parliament, the Parliament of Canada. And the student asks you, speaking specifically as a Christian, Professor, as a Christian, what should my disposition toward that place be? Of course, the question really is about what should I think about what's going on in the Canadian Parliament? What should my disposition toward politics be? How do you think you'd respond to that?
I, by and large, I'd say keep your distance. Don't invest too much. Be responsible to the ways you can as a citizen of a country. Know who you're voting for. Do vote for your members of parliament. Try to stay abreast of big issues, but don't invest too much in this. Why? Largely, Parliament is going to go on according to the rules of large organizations and the political systems where you live. And Canada has its own set that's both similar and different from other places. You have very little influence over that. Even if you want to spend all your life trying to have influence over that, you're going to have very little influence over that. You want to know what's going on, and you want, because this is where God has placed you in this country where things function this way, the parliamentary system. You want to play your role because we're all given such a role wherever we are. The real issue is to know what your life is about. And as a Christian, you have to ask what is the purpose of this life God has created me to live? I believe strongly and more strongly than ever that the purpose of our lives is to recognize God is our creator and the gifts he has given us as creatures, to say thank you with our lives, to offer, that is, the gifts God has given us as creatures back to God with the voice of praise and confession of thanks. It's both very simplistic and sentimental sounding, and yet it is what most people have tried to do most of human history in some fashion or another, with revelation of the law of Judaism and then revelation of Christ. It's been done with a certain articulate clarity, more and more of a specific kind, because I think Christians are called, in a sense, to be witnesses to the creating goodness and love, which is shown in the self-giving of the Son of God, Jesus Christ, to the world. Um, Spending all our time worrying about Parliament is that it couldn't be, and its machinations and legislations, there couldn't be something that's pertinent to this larger vocation or smaller vocation. By and large, most of it isn't. Most of it's about policies regarding land use and taxation and this, that, and the other. I make a distinction between what I call normal politics and abnormal. Normal politics is what any given collective nation community uses to keep going. And it can be done better or worse according to people's opinions. But it's actually a fairly modest set of concerns. Keep things running. You know,
Explain.
Mussolini made the trains run on time. That was viewed as kind of a fascistic reductionism. I think that's wrong. Mussolini was a bad person, so I'm not commending him. Trains running on time is what we want. It helps us do the things we need to do, get to our children, get to our work, go see a dying parent. We need that. So we ought to be interested in government making things work for us. Politically, I want to do normal politics, which is to help my society keep the gears running. But other than that, my goal to is to love another human being, to raise a family, to work hard, to take joy around a table with my body, caring for one another, and so on and so forth, and dying well. That's my real goal. So the normal politics is necessary and useful. Every once in a while, then the distinction I make is normal politics and then abnormal politics. That's when everything is falling. And then the very ability to do what I'm called to do as a creature of God, to live in a certain way, to give thanks to God for being his creature, is threatened. And there are things, there my attention may well get drawn into spending more and more time politically on the one hand, or possibly even sort of dealing with the kinds of things that protests and the wars and so on. I'm not commending those either, but we are pressed sometimes. My sense, though, is that by and large, in our era in the West, normal and abnormal, just everything is abnormal. Everything is of the highest importance for the survival. The title of my book is Mortal Goods, just to be clear. The gifts God has given us in our creaturehood to tend and offer back are these mortal goods. My life, my sharing of my life through procreation or marriage or in friendship and being an immediate neighbor.
So I want to ask you about, when politics become abnormal, here's kind of what was going through my mind. A deal with politicians. I'll vote for you, and in exchange, you keep society running, fill up the potholes, make sure the mail is predictable. And I may not agree with everything you do, but so long as you don't screw things up too much, we'll be okay. So I'll vote for you, or I won't be too fervent in trying to take you down voting for someone else. But we'll basically just decide to get along, and if society runs okay, no big deal. But if I begin to feel, now here's where I'm kind of riffing on my own, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. But if I'm beginning to feel that you are in some sense becoming my adversary because you're threatening, the decisions you're making are threatening, jeopardizing the basic goods of my life, and making it really hard for my kid to get a decent education because of policies you put into place, making it really hard to feel hopeful about the future because of policies you're putting into place. Then if I begin to feel like, okay, the deal's broke. I voted for you to keep things running, and you are persistently screwing things up. Then it sounds like you're saying, so then there might be a place for folks who really don't want to get involved much in politics to become more involved in some way. Is that
Yeah,
kind
that's
of?
true. And so in my there's a caveat to that, but in my current situation, what are some of the things? I mean, they don't affect me personally, but they do affect other people I'm committed to, very much so, family and friends. Some of the places where I think that abnormal politics are beckoning would be in areas like euthanasia, medically assisted suicide, transgender, state-sponsored transgender treatment, or people calling it gender affirming treatment, where parents themselves are taken out of the equation. Um, a few other things. Um, and I do protest. Now, I don't protest, and I haven't gotten up posters, and I'm not sure how effective that is anyway, but I try to write about these things and go online and do my interviews and so on, and spend time talking about that and informing myself more than I might otherwise about some of these matters. History tells us that, I mean, we can look at what has happened, that wholehearted self-giving over to abnormal politics often makes things worse.
Yeah, almost.
Um,
Yeah, almost.
almost always, actually. But, maybe in the long run, we could say, yeah, eventually things got better 3 generations from now. But what about the mortal goods, the very things I've been pressed into this situation for? There's no question that the Russian invasion of the Ukraine opened the floodgates to the pressures for Ukrainians to move into the realm of abnormal politics. War, in effect, defend our nation, our children. I'm, in a sense, a supporter of that. It made sense to me. It's now 2.5 years, not quite 2+ years later. There's close to 1 million people dead on both sides, most of them young men, some young women, civilians and others, children, people's parents, people's siblings. Where are we going to end up? I don't know. And for the Christian, okay, so if you're a Christian in the Ukraine, what is your vocation? I'm not saying it's clear, by the way. That's the point. It's not clear to me. Would one be a Christian in the Ukraine under a Russian regime that had been imposed upon you? Would you still be a faithful Christian in the sense of of tending the mortal goods, faithful in my sense, as well as worshiping and praying and teaching your faith to your children. Could you do that? It's possible. It's also possible not, by the way. So I'm not claiming I understand that decision. But these are decisions that are really hard. Now, this is hard in the Ukraine, even when things are so clear. It's like in the United States when things are so murky as to where is it going here and there. I mean, some things are clear, some issues are clear. They always have to do with other issues. So um, I'm not, as I said, ruling out our call as Christians to move into the realm of we're pushed usually. I mean, the call isn't so much a call as it is a kind of a necessary um, demand. We're pushed in the realm of abnormal politics, but I don't think anybody should think that that realm is one would want to go into, stay in, or what do I want to say? Sort of theorize about. It's utterly untheoretical what happens there. You got to pull back as quickly as you go in, otherwise you're lost.
Let me read to you some lines from your book and then just listen to you kind of expound on them. You ask a question, is politics about attaining heaven and the permanent? So the pursuit of utopia, which we do see in various political movements. You say to think so is to sell one's soul to the engulfing corruptions involved with bringing heaven to earth. So I'm interested in that. Someone wants to bring heaven to earth. Sounds good. But you say, no, this is going to engulf your soul in corruption. How so?
Well, I mean, put that way, and I put it in a fairly straightforward way. I doubt most people would disagree, frankly. I mean, utopianism is not. There have been a few people who think utopianism is sort of the great thing that we have to offer as Christians, as philosophers, whatever, to get us to a better place. But I think by and large, most people sense that utopianism is not just unrealistic, it's dangerous. One of the great 20th century political philosophers I have admired, Jacob Talman, was a European, then Israeli writer, wrote a book about messianic politics, in which he traces to the French Revolution in a very particular modern way. And of course, and others, redemption through sin is what another famous Jewish scholar called this whole movement from Sholem. Redemption through sin. That's the idea. We'll kill people in order to make a better world. And they were talking mostly at the time about communism and obviously certain forms of fascism mid-century. And most people know that that doesn't make sense. But I don't think most people realize the degree to which unconsciously we actually are working on a kind of modest version of a utopian redemption through sin model, the messianic model. I mean, the very use of messianism, the phrase in modern political theory, has been consciously drawn from both Judaism and Christianity. Secular messianism. We're going to bring in the kingdom of God, and Christians have been talking about this for a long time, mostly on the margins, until early modernity, when building the kingdom of God on earth became an acceptable and central way for Christians to talk. Puritans, some Methodists, then social progressivists, and we're still now. This is common parlance today across the board, both in Reformed circles, some evangelical circles, and a lot of progressivist circles. That's the permanent. And everything that I read in the Bible tells me that that is not only not going to happen, it's actually going to, yes, corrupt one's soul. There is a distinction between heaven and earth. We don't know what heaven is. We know it's different from this. We also know there's a continuity, but what's the continuity built upon? It's not built upon having created as close a replica of the heavenly Jerusalem on earth. It's built upon having lived most closely the life of Jesus. I mean, that is our connection to heaven here on earth looks like Jesus. And
Yeah.
politically, that makes little sense according to this notion. That's the giving up part, the non-permanent part. We expend ourselves on that which God has given us, which is one another, um, most closely our families, um, and 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 on that, in that self expenditure, in thanks, as I say, in praise of God, if you will, a window is opened, or a door is opened, or a bridge is cast from this world to the next. Um, so heaven on earth is an impossibility. People who yearn for a society of perfect peace, Christian or non-Christian, I think we need to move the yearning. We need to articulate what we are called to yearn for elsewhere. We are called to yearn for God, for society of perfect peace. And that God is much bigger than our imaginations of social relations that are without any trouble to them. Um, Again, I think Christians have something to teach people in this. And to me, it's a debasement of our Christian calling. We're so willing to actually just speak in the terms of its kind of politically narrow understanding of what redemption looks like.
So what's kind of running through what I'm hearing from you, the idea is your view is that it's a mistake for the vast majority of us. I mean, there may be some people whose life calling really is to be involved in politics, but for the great majority of us, it's a big mistake to give as much time as a lot of us do to thinking about politics. And I don't think you say this, but I'm kind of attaching this idea to that. And we're also doing politicians a disservice by treating them as if they are much more important than they really should be, because then that empowers them to, continue doing what they're going to do. And I know that we've always got ambitious people who are self-serving, who will accumulate as much power for themselves as they can. But it does sound to me like a basic theme is that for most of us who do spend a lot of time thinking about politics, probably the world would be better off. We would be better off as individuals if we spent more time thinking about things of more fundamental, basic importance to our lives. That is, the relationships that we have, the lives that we have, the very, very, very small number of things that are to some extent under our control, rather than being exasperated by things that people in Ottawa, that things in people in Washington, D.C. are doing over which we cannot have control. There's a lot of energy and time expenditure going into that kind of political stuff that could be much better expended on things of more basic importance.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you've summarized that. The thing is that it's not. I wouldn't want to say, therefore, all I'm concerned about is my family in my little house, behind my walls, my garden fences, because our lives are constantly abutting, meeting, engaging other people. And it's appropriate, but it's an issue of scope here. I'm a hungry person who I walk by every day to work, is somebody I am called to turn to without a question. I mean, Jesus does have things to say, the Good Samaritan and so on, which has become a classic text in this regard. I honestly think that I've seen it. I've seen it myself. Like, we can spend more time trying to figure out policies that will help hunger uh, 5,000 miles away. And there is the person on the street right there. Why? And I use that both literally and symbolically. So I do think that there's a lot of, is that politics though? Yes, it is. But is it policy? Is it getting, difficult stuff to figure out. I'm not claiming, what I've talked about isn't a blueprint for how to fix society. That's the whole point. It's not. It's a call to order our sights much more closely to the realm of our mortal existence, which include other people, of course, our neighbors and communities. And if we can teach people to be more concerned about where they live and how they live with the people they live with, rather than the whole world being reordered, the whole country, I think we will have done something useful, small way. I don't know.
Was it Malawi you were talking about earlier?
Burundi,
Burundi, I'm sorry.
Burundi. Yeah.
Yeah, so you spent time in Burundi, and what you just said reminded me of I was in a different country in Central America. Um, and I asked a group I was speaking to, I said, what do you imagine for your country, 10 years from now? And one of them, the pastor actually of a church said, and we were meeting in his church. He said, well, I imagine, I hope for a country where, there's not so much trash all over the place. And I responded to him and said, well, there's a whole bunch of trash right outside your church that you could do something right now and pick that trash up right now rather than waiting for the government, the central government of this country to do something about that. I mean, it is within your power, in this little part of the country that you inhabit to do something about that. So I don't know if that's relevant or not, but
Well, no, I think it is. And I think that, um, one of the major issues and the deep problems of our world and our societies is that we don't all think alike, and people do stupid things and mean things and horrible things. You multiply that within the complex systems of any society, and you have the messes that we see. But solving those messes does ultimately demand that people become different kinds of people. You can talk to somebody about paying attention to the garbage that's around them. If you have a relationship with them, that talking becomes a potential place where illumination and change of mind can begin. That's true in our families. That's true in marriages. That's true in friendships. I don't see how, given that that's not true for this government of the United States, why does anybody think that we're going to solve all these problems by just telling everybody what's better than what they're doing? I don't see that. It seems obvious to me. We have trouble in our own marriages. How in the world are we going to get through solving the issues of Texas versus Massachusetts? Whatever. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
I do actually think some of my views are influenced by my Anglican nation and setting, perhaps not in an obvious way. Um, the Church of England, which is the foundation of Anglicanism as it spread around the world, peculiar sort of thing, which is why it doesn't fit well lots of other places, seemingly. It was a national church under a king and a monarch with bishops that were all, it was very medieval, um, um, was not particularly democratic, but it had, was the British system, which had its own nascent constitutional and separation of powers and so on. What was peculiar about it was precisely the fact that Christians, we'll call them Anglican Christians, understood that their lives, in a sense, were taken care of by, now I'm exaggerating, the managers of the church and the government. And their job was to listen to the scriptures and to order their lives in a very personal way, obediently. It's pretty straightforward. And thus, if you look at, it's one of my favorite texts in the Book of Common Prayer, not nearly said enough as it used to be, hardly said at all, the great, so-called Great Litany, which was meant to be said once a month or perhaps more often. It's a long prayer of asking God for this, that, and the other, pleading with God, petitions, and so on. And it goes through this whole series of elements of life um, uh, that both name who God is in terms of the incarnation and the Trinity in Jesus's life, and then on the basis of that, petitions God for deliverance from this ill or that ill, for help in being this kind of person or that kind of person. And it's all framed. It's very inclusive and comprehensive sense that our calling is to live faithfully in the mortal limits of our life. And that's why we pray. It's why we sing. Um, but there's a whole lot of explication of promise beyond that. Actually, I think that's very Anglican. So call this an Anglican perspective. It's not the only one. But the notion of mortality as framing our deepest hopes before God in Christ is, I would argue, a very peculiarly Anglican view.